What's going on, everyone? My name is Ryan Morey. I'm here with Saltwater Sportsman, and in today's video we are talking about popping for tuna. So put simply, popping for tuna is using a popping lure, a topwater lure with cup-shaped mouth, creating a bunch of commotion on the surface in order to entice a bite from a large feeding tuna. Now, why would you want to do this? A lot of the time tuna are going to be feeding on bait. They're going to have an entire bait ball up on the surface. There might be birds feeding, and you want to throw something that's going to simulate that surface feeding action. You want to throw something that's going to create a bunch of commotion, it's going to get noticed, and a tuna is going to want to suck it off the top of the water. It's an ideal presentation in a situation like that. If you guys have any questions about gear, I'm going to be covering tons of gear at the end of this video, so just stick around to the end and all those questions will be answered. Where/when would you like to use a popper for tuna? So ideally, you want to find fish feeding on the surface. So tuna, a lot of the times you're going to see explosions on the surface. You're going to see fish literally jumping out of the water. You're going to see bait balls frolicking on top, all nervous because there's tuna around. Those are the situations that you're going to want to look for when you're throwing something like this. If you're out in a completely empty ocean and you're not seeing any surface activity, it's probably not the ideal scenario. But when you do find that scenario, there's few tactics that are going to beat popping for tuna. So the very first thing is the cast. Ideally, you want to be able to cast as far as you possibly can. Typically, that's why you have fairly long rods. The further you cast, the better you're going to be able to work your popper, because your line is going to be low to the ground, low to the water, and the popper is going to work the most effectively. It's not going to pop up, spring up, foul on itself. So being able to cast a long way, having a nice open front of the boat is huge when you're trying to get yourself in the strike zone. The retrieve is fairly rhythmic. Pulling, popping, that popper's throwing a bunch of commotion. And sometimes, especially if I'm not seeing a lot of fish feeding, I just know that there's surface feeding fish in the area. What I'm going to do is I'm going to pop it, and I'll give it a 3 to 4 count, because that just looks like a fish feeding on top. Other fish are going to swoop in, try and find that commotion. So I don't want searching fish to not be able to find my popper because I retrieved it so fast. I want to have it spend a little bit of time in that strike zone if I know those fish are around. Give them time to find it. If the fish are absolutely blowing up, going crazy, and I cast in the middle of them, I'm going to work it fairly faster. I'm going to work it quick, work it quick, work it quick. Sometimes it pays to work it all the way back to the boat. Give a fish time to find it, and they eat it fairly close to you. Next up is the strike. Once you actually have a tuna come up and pop on your lure, the immediate reaction you're going to have is to start setting the hook like a crazy madman. That's what you want to avoid. You want to wait until you feel this fish. You want to wait till he's pulling really hard. You got the rod doubled over. Then once he's tight and you know you're tight on him, that's when you can start setting the hook. A lot of the time these fish are going to eat your popper and they're going to start swimming straight towards you. So cranking is actually the move, keeping that line tight immediately. And once that fish is securely tight, you can set him a couple times if you feel like it. So now we are hooked up and we are fighting a fish. Typically, with most fishing, it might actually be the easy part. That's not true in tuna fishing, because tuna are so big, so strong, and can be so erratic when you're fighting them. So the number one thing I want you guys to focus on is keeping the line tight over everything. Because what tuna can do is they're going to be pulling hard in one direction, and then suddenly you might be slack, and you're like, oh, I lost it. In actuality, that tuna has turned around and he's running straight towards you. So that's why you need a high gear ratio reel to be able to reel, catch up with him, and stay tight with that fish. Number one, by far the most important thing. Number two, you need to keep constant pressure on these things, because if you're resting, they're resting. They are big, strong, and they pull like no other fish in the ocean. When they're straight up and down, they're just doing these spins, using their body as just leverage against the water, just sitting like, it's almost like trying to pull in a 50-gallon drum full of water. It's so heavy, and you need to put constant pressure on these things. If you need to hand the rod off to someone else, especially if you're using spinning gear like this, hand the rod off to someone else. You're not, a man for fighting this thing for 3 hours. In actuality, you're actually just putting that fish in danger of getting sharked. So hand it off for a couple minutes, get back on the rod, put pressure on this thing, get it in the boat. That's the most important thing. This really is a team sport. Number 3, once he's doing his pinwheeling, this fish is straight up and down, you're in the second half of the fight, you need to make sure, even though you're tired, you cannot let this line touch the gunnel of the boat, because that fish is going to be pulling on you. You do not allow this line to touch anything. Keep it off the gunnel. Many fish are lost just because guys get tired and the line touches something it shouldn't. The line pops because it's under such heavy tension. Number 4, if you're on a charter, you really don't have to worry about this, but if you're out with the boys, the person driving the boat needs to be in constant communication with the angler. You guys need to, the guy driving the boat needs to know which way the fish is going, because he needs to be able to back up or go forward, keep this fish away from the engines, keep this fish away from other boats, keep this fish away from another fish. If you're hooked up to 2 or 3 at one time, you need to have constant communication, and the guy driving the boat is essential to making sure that big fish gets in. Okay, now you fought the fish close to the boat. Maybe it took you 5 minutes, maybe it took you 2 hours. Every fish is different. But one thing you gotta do is not mess up the gaff. So this fish is coming close, he's doing his little circles around the boat. There's gonna be multiple opportunities to sink a gaff into this fish. If the fish is around 4 to 6 feet under the surface and you have a real long gaff, I would not advise trying to gaff that fish, because especially if it's a big one, many grown men have been pulled in by tuna that they sunk gaffs into. So wait for a proper shot, maybe his head's 2 feet under the surface, or maybe his head's out of the water already, and you wanna sink that gaff around the gills, around the head area, but you don't wanna ever gaff over the line. You wanna get more than 1 gaff in him, ideally 2 if it's a real big fish, maybe even 3, and then you want to haul that fish in on a bit with 1, 2, 3, pull him in the boat. Congratulations, you caught a big tuna. Now, let's cover our gear. When you're popping for tuna, typically you're gonna be using spinning gear. Spinning gear is the most popular. Sizes of reels. You're gonna be using a 14,000 all the way up to a 20,000 size reel. On the very expensive end, you have the Shimano Stellas and you have the Daiwa Saltigas. On the more economical end, you have things like the Shimano Saragosa. Those are all great reels that have caught many big tuna in their time. Typically, I like to fish anywhere from 50-pound all the way up to 80-pound braid. The lighter the braid, the better casting distance you're gonna get. The heavier the braid, the more confidence you're gonna have when you're fighting that big fish. Caught big fish all the way down to 40-pound braid, so it can be done, but I would not advise it. When it comes to a rod, you're gonna want something long, 7.5 to 8 feet, because you wanna have that casting distance in order to get that popper right where the fish are feeding. You also wanna be able to have that popper worked properly. So you need a rod that is stiff enough that it's gonna be able to pull that concave head through the water and make a bunch of commotion. So a real flimsy rod is not ideal. Typically popping rods are fairly stiff and then have more of a parabolic bend when you're catching them. This rod I have right here is made by Ocean Devil. It is 8'3" and it is rated for like 50 to 80-pound line. Really, really strong rod. Stiff enough to turn those big fish. In terms of poppers, you have tons of ones on the market. This is one of the more premium brands. This is called the Black Ledge, and I have it rigged with some heavy gauge aftermarket BKK hooks. These heavy hooks will not typically bend out unless something crazy happens. And in my opinion, when you're investing all this time, all this money into catching a big fish, you want to put the time in and make sure you have good gear like these heavy gauge BKK hooks. If you wanted to get a more economical popper, things like the Yozuri mag popper work, things like the Rapala Magnums, all work. They're all gonna throw a ton of commotion. They just don't have as long of a life as the more premium poppers. If you guys have any questions about popping, I want you to comment them down below. We'll be sure to get back to you. Again, thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.